Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. I appreciate you being with me here on Now TV. Listen, we have been looking at, and will continue to look at, the challenge of Christ. I hope that you have become acutely aware of how important it is that believers in Christ be able to meet the challenge of Christ. Now, if you're new to us in watching this program, let me just ever so briefly, I get started on this and I really go off on, I just like to get on my soapbox about it because it's so critically important. But here in summation form is the challenge of Christ. In John chapter 10:37, Jesus said, "If I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me." Listen, folks, it couldn't get any clearer than that. It's plain, it's straightforward, it's unambiguous, it cannot be misunderstood. Jesus said, "The Father's given me works to do." Now, that covers a lot of territory, okay? But the Father gave him works to do. And here's Jesus standing in front of a hostile crowd. Over and over and over this happened. But nonetheless, in John chapter 10, he's standing in front of a hostile crowd and he is saying to them, "If I do not do what the Father gave me to do, don't believe me." Now, I've pointed out before, ladies and gentlemen, this is not only an incredible challenge, but it is a distinctive challenge. Other world religions really don't like to be challenged. They don't like questions, okay? Some of them even get violent if you challenge their claims. Not so with Jesus. Jesus is the only founder. How should I express that? Jesus is the only central figure of a world religion that openly invites, openly challenges those who would think about him, those who would consider being his disciples, challenges them, challenges all of us. Look at me, look at my works, look at what I said that I will do, and if I do not do this, if I do not fulfill my promises, if I do not fulfill my prophecies, don't believe me. Folks, this is absolutely incredible. So what we have focused on for a little over 2 years now is the fact that Jesus said he was going to come back in power, in glory, with the angels, in judgment of all men in the first century. Skeptics, atheists, agnostics, Jews, Muslims, unfortunately, many former Christians, tell us he did not do that. And my response is, well, if you could prove that he did not keep his word about coming back, coming in judgment, then I'll join you as an atheist. But you can't prove that without holding on to certain presuppositions that are completely and totally unbiblical. So, we've covered an awful lot of territory, and we've wound up in the book of Revelation. And the reason that we've gone to Revelation is because most believers today, most people who call themselves Christians, they look to the book of Revelation as the key that unlocks human history and human future. I mean to tell you, over the last little bit on YouTube and on Facebook, I have encountered one Christian after another, one believer after another, who tells me that if I do not believe that Revelation is yet to be fulfilled, I am a heretic, I am a false teacher, I'm doomed to hell. Yet when you start really getting down to the brass tacks of the language, the linguistics of the book of Revelation, what it actually said to people living 2,000 years ago, all of a sudden these individuals abandon the discussion. Well, generally not before leaving behind, an entire list of name calling. You get the idea? So what I've been doing is sharing with you the following thesis, basically. The book of Revelation, and we're not going to study it verse by verse. I've already shared that with you. We're going to study it thematically. But the book of Revelation tells us at the beginning of the book, in the middle of the book, and in the last of the book, these things must shortly come to pass. Now, what do people do? Futurists, those in the future camp of Christianity, it doesn't matter if it's postmillennial, amillennial, or dispensational, or premillennial. Now, there are a few variations. Some postmillennialists would essentially agree with the position that I take, although when it comes to the millennium, they jump ship inconsistently. But nonetheless, these are individuals, and they go to the book of Revelation and they say, well, of course John was told these things must shortly come to pass, but they haven't come to pass yet, but they're just about to. And so what happens is the language of Revelation is taken away from the recipients, the original recipients of the book, completely ripped away from them and posited right squarely in the lap of modern readers. Oh, yeah, those things weren't going to happen in their lifetime, but they're going to happen in ours. Somebody popped up on my YouTube just recently and just insists, the church is just getting ready to be snatched off of this earth any day now. Absolutely any day now. Well, when I've offered refutation, he ignores everything I say. In fact, I'm convinced at this point he's using a pseudonym. I suspect he is an enemy of covenant eschatology that just decided to take on this new name, this new title, and appear on my YouTube channel posting all sorts of nonsense. He only joined YouTube, supposedly, in August of 2022. And there's absolutely nothing in his profile about who he is. So, like I said, I suspect he's nothing really but a rabble-rouser. He doesn't have the courage to identify himself truthfully, even though I've challenged him to do so. And so all he does is pop up and say, rapture in a minute now. Rapture in a minute now. This is it. This is the end. We're there. And look, folks, people have been doing this for 2,000 years. It's time the church, broadly considered, comes to grips with what the book actually says. So what we have done is we have examined what Jesus said, what John was told, Revelation chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to him to show to his servants things which must shortly come to pass. Now look, if you're living 2,000 years ago, and John the Apostle approaches you and says, I have a letter from the Lord, and the Lord told me these things must shortly come to pass. Are you seriously supposed to believe that John was being told, don't worry about when this is going to take place? But I just want to assure you that when these things finally get around to being fulfilled, they're going to happen with a rapid occurrence. Folks, that is nonsense. It absolutely is nonsense. Then, in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 3, after being told, blessed is he who reads the words of the prophets of this book and keeps these words, the time is at hand. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been sharing with you that the word time there is a very distinctive Greek word. It is used some 85 times in the New Testament. It is the Greek word kairos. Kairos means appointed time. Now, let me offer a very quick little caveat. There are instances in which kairos does not mean specifically divinely appointed time. It can mean to the, or can refer to, let's say, how should we express this? The appointed time of created order. And here's what I mean by that. And by the way, I did a readout on, actually Daniel Rogers sent this to me, in Mark chapter 11, verse 13. Jesus is approaching Bethany, or coming from Bethany, and seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf. He went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for the figs. Now, there's a whole lot going on here. Fascinating story. But nonetheless, here's what's important to see. Now, he saw a fig tree with leaves on it. In the normal process of the seasons, the seasons that God established by setting the sun, the moon, the stars in the sky, and made them for days, for weeks, for months, for signs and for seasons. Genesis 1:14. So fig trees put out their leaves, and then they put out their figs. Well, here is a fig tree that put out its leaves. It had leaves on it. Anyone passing by, and by the way, Bethany was the normal route by which pilgrims approached Jerusalem. And you have to understand, in the ancient world, that you were not allowed to pick all of the fruit off of all of the fruit-bearing trees or plants or what have you, so that the poor would be able to pluck the fruit and be able to eat, have something to eat to sustain themselves. So, standing as it were on the way from Bethany to Jerusalem, it wasn't the time, it was not the kairos, the normally appointed time for figs to actually appear on this tree. It wasn't even really time for the trees, for the leaves. So it was not the season for figs. It was not the kairos. Because you see, seasons come, seasons go, spring, summer, fall, and winter. Those are appointed times of nature. Those are appointed times of fig bearing. This particular fig was putting out its leaves way prematurely. Something's wrong here. And so, when Jesus approached the tree, had leaves on it. Leaves on a fig tree means fruit. Pardon me. No fruit found. And so Jesus curses the fig tree. The point being here that when Mark records for us, it was not the season for figs. He was pointing out the regular progression of the seasons that were appointed in and by nature. The sign of the fig tree, the sign of the leaves on the fig tree, would normally indicate there would be figs on the tree. The tree had leaves, but it had no figs because it was not the time for the figs. So do you see that even though the word kairos can be used in a context in which it's not talking about divinely appointed time. Now, could we extrapolate and say, well, yeah, God appointed the season for the growing of the figs, for the putting forth of the leaves and the bringing forth of the leaves? I understand that. Okay? I'm not arguing against that. I'm simply pointing out that this is not a text that would bring to our mind a divinely appointed time, except in that extended sense. Now, there are other examples of this in the New Testament, in which kairos does not point to an eschatologically, divinely appointed time. But, boy, there are all sorts of passages. I've already shared with you Mark 4:17, where Jesus said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. The time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven has drawn near. And I've shared with you how F.F. Bruce, noted scholar, points out to us that that terminology that is used there means that Jesus was calling their attention to the fact that the Old Testament prophets foretold a divinely appointed time for the establishment of the kingdom. Daniel chapter 2, in the days of the fourth empire, which would be in the days of Rome, in the days of these kings, the God of heaven shall set up a kingdom that shall never be shaken. It shall never be moved. So you see, God looked down through the stream of time, and God set the time for the establishment of the kingdom in the days of the Roman Empire. Here is Jesus, who appeared in the days of the Roman Empire and said, the time is fulfilled. The divinely appointed time, and notice he says, has drawn near. That which was not near at one time. And boy, this is so critical. And let me just make just an ever so brief digression here. In order to escape all of the New Testament time statements, opponents of covenant eschatology want to tell us, well, look, when the New Testament says the parousia of Christ has drawn near, or is near, or is here, James chapter 5 or 6, they're not saying that the coming of the Lord has drawn near. They're not saying the coming of the Lord is imminent. They're just simply saying God is always around us. He is never far from us, for in him we live, we move, we have our very being, Paul said in Acts chapter 17. So what they do is, the opponents of covenant eschatology, is they say that the coming of the Lord is at hand, the parousia of the Lord is drawn near. It's talking spatially. My Bible is at hand. My Bible is near. And it's literally at hand. It's in hand, right? But the problem of it is, ladies and gentlemen, to say that my Bible is at hand is to say that it is imminent. After all, there it is. Right there. It's not far off. It's not a long time off. It's at hand. So this is really a self-defeating argument. But it's important to note this, of how the critics of covenant eschatology want to change the meaning of at hand from temporal imminence to spatial proximity, when in reality, it doesn't help their argument at all. Because let me reiterate, this is so critical. If you're going to say that the parousia of the Lord is here, and that's spatial, then by that very statement, you are saying that his presence is temporally near. And that's unavoidable. Period. Okay, so what is so significant here, ladies and gentlemen, is that kairos is used over and over and over in the New Testament in eschatological text. And here's what I want you to grasp. You must catch the power of this. Because you see, once we catch the power of what I'm about to share with you, then all attempts to negate the time statements of the New Testament, they literally just go up in smoke. I mean, they are shattered like broken ice or broken frost, if you please. A little bit of a joke. So, here's what I mean. The Old Testament foretold, ordained, designated, appointed, as we've just indicated, the time for the coming of the kingdom. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, when God set the time for the establishment of the kingdom, and by the way, some former preterists are now saying that Daniel chapter 2 has nothing to do with the days of Jesus. It's not foretelling the days of Rome. But of course, when you ask them, well, okay, according to you, then Daniel 2 just simply takes us to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, then explain to us, show to us, prove to us, manifest to us what everlasting kingdom which shall never, ever, ever pass away, was established by Yahweh in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century BC. And all of a sudden they go silent. All of a sudden they disappear from the conversation. Why is that? Well, because they can't show you the everlasting kingdom, a kingdom not made with hands, that mountain cut out without hands, Daniel 2:44, which would belong, by the way, to the last days. They cannot show you the establishment of that eternal, unending kingdom that was established in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes. And secondly, they can't prove that the days of Antiochus Epiphanes were the last days. And yet, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar through inspiration of the Holy Spirit that the vision that he saw was a vision ultimately for the last days. Well, guess what? Jesus appeared in the last days. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1. Daniel was not living in the last days. The Babylonian Empire was not the last days. The Medo-Persian Empire was not the last days. The Grecian Empire was not the last days. The Roman Empire in the 1st century was the last days. And more specifically and more accurately, it was the last days of the Old Covenant world, the Old Covenant age. Not the last days of time, not the last days of the Christian age, and no, it wasn't the last days of Rome. It was the last days of God's Old Covenant people. So, what's the point? The point is, here is Daniel being told about a designated, appointed time, the last days, in which the kingdom would be established. God appointed the last days. God appointed the days of the Roman Empire as the days when the kingdom would be established. Now, here's where our dispensational friends kind of go into spasms. And I'm not trying to be mean at all. Because here's what they do. They tell us, Thomas Ice in his book, End Time Controversy, tells us there's no doubt that the first century was the time appointed by the Father. Now, this is not a quote. If you want the quote, contact me. I'll get you the exact quote, but I'm not misrepresenting what he said. But Thomas Ice says, and other dispensationalists agree, Dwight Pentecost, John Walvoord, Tim LaHaye, all of the leading dispensational authors, writers, speakers, Mark Hitchcock, etc., they all tell us the first century was the divinely appointed time for the kingdom. Jesus came and he made a legitimate, truthful, objective offer of the kingdom to the Jews. The Jews, in unbelief, rejected that offer. Consequently, that Jewish unbelief made it, quote, impossible, unquote. That's Thomas Ice's own word. That Jewish unbelief made it impossible for God to establish the kingdom at the time that had been appointed. Now, in the first place, you ought to just really consider that. The unbelief of man thwarted God's prophetic plan. And yet Paul said, has the unbelief of man thwarted God? God forbid. Let God be true and every man a liar, Romans chapter 3. Yeah, you know, I've gone over this territory and it's absolutely critical. Man's failure, man's unbelief was not going to thwart God's kingdom plan. God set the time, days of the Roman Empire. He sent John saying, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Jesus came. The kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Ladies and gentlemen, the appointed time was present in the first century. And my time is up. I want to thank you for joining me. I'll see you next week.